Originally, in today's video, I was going to do the same thing with Batman villains that I recently did with Spider-Man villains. Draw them into the Star Wars universe, and come up with different versions of their stories to figure out how they would better fit into that franchise. But I was kind of feeling in a fantasy-focused mood, so I thought, let's go the D&D route instead with Batman villains. So in today's episode, I've taken 4 iconic nemeses of the Dark Knight, rewritten their origins to fit into a fantasy setting, and of course, done some fun designs to go along with them. And without further ado, let's get into the first one now. Venice Ill had always had an obsession with ice and winter. While his family had sent him away to be trained as a well-rounded wizard, he spent all of his time researching ice magic specifically. He even did experiments with ice wizardry on himself, leaving parts of his body permanently in a frosted state. He thought this might be able to make him live longer, but they were still dangerous experiments he was doing on himself. You see, he was specifically fascinated by ice's preservation ability, how something could be frozen and remain unharmed and unchanged for decades. This led him to read farther into a story that many had heard rumors about in the kingdom of Norreus, but had never been proven. It was thought just to be a rumor or a myth. You see, the current queen, Alia, had gotten her throne when her mother mysteriously vanished. But rumor had it that the prior queen, Fiella, had enraged the goddess of winter, Auril, and because of that, Auril had cursed Fiella to remain frozen and undying in a mountain of ice for all eternity. Venice Ill had been told that the story was a myth, but the more he researched and looked into it, the more real it started to seem, and the more convinced he was that this was not a myth, but history that had been covered up. He began studying more and more ice magic and into dark magic and ice curses, learning everything he could while exploring all of the mountains in the area, trying to find something that seemed enchanted or that could contain the cursed Queen Fiella. Venice Ill did this continuing through his studies until his graduation, and this was a celebration that the current Queen Alia visited in person. And Venice Ill was enraged by the very sight of her. He assumed that the only reason Queen Fiella's story had been covered up was because Queen Alia wanted the throne faster. Her mother could have lived another 3 or 4 decades, so Venice Ill thought that Alia was selfishly allowing her mother to stay frozen in eternal isolation simply to have a longer rule on the throne. It was cruelty that Venice Ill would not stand for. As he was brought up on stage and was the closest that he would get to Queen Alia, before being handed his graduation parchment, he spun his cane out and cast a curse upon the current queen. A curse that he believed very similar to the one Fiella was under currently. He swore to only awaken Alia when Fiella was found and freed and replaced on the throne. Everyone urged him that the myths were false. The royal advisor swore that the story was just something conspiracy theorists had devised to stir people up. But Venice Ill refused to believe it. The guards moved to arrest him, but he fled. They rained fire behind him, but he was a powerful enough ice wizard that he could fight them off and defend himself and continue to flee. To this day, his agreement still stands that he will only release the queen when Fiella is found, and he continues to search and search as he is hunted down by the queen's guard. But is the story of Fiella just a myth? Has Venice Ill frozen the current queen under the sway of a false tale? Perhaps the story will only be finished when a certain Dark Knight figures out the truth. Many years ago, in the crime-ridden city of Gothalo, a lowly yet aspiring jester prepared for a show. A small show by most standards, but the biggest that he'd ever done. It was at a popular tavern called the Ace of Hearts. The night of the show, he got on stage to nearly a full house. Of course, most were not focused on the stage, but were focused on their drinks and conversation. But he felt confident that he could bring their attention to him. He could just imagine them all watching and praising his magnificent dual act, where he would not only tell jokes that he thought were particularly funny, but he would juggle not 3, but 4 throwing knives. They were admittedly dull, but it still looked dangerous enough. He eagerly started into his act, and after a few minutes, nobody was really watching. He tried speaking louder, and this did draw some attention. After the next joke, this led to booing. His hands started to quiver, but he tried to keep going. He told joke after joke, and more people were paying attention, but that just meant more people were booing. They were not entertained. And as his hands started to tremble more and more, the first knife slipped, followed by all the others, and they landed down and smashed on a table in front of him, shattering the glasses of the patrons. The large, angry bar dwellers grabbed him and pulled him off the stage and beat him and then threw him from the tavern. The broken jester lay in the mud, tears streaming down his face. He'd never felt like more of a failure. And someone took advantage of his broken state. Members of the Falcone Crime Guild had been watching and came outside to comfort the jester. They told him that the men who had just pulled him down and beaten him were members of the Moroni family, and that the best way to get back at them would be to help the Falcones smash up their newly built textiles shop. The jester wasn't a particularly vengeful man, but he saw an opportunity in this and told the Falcones that he would help them if they brought him on as the Falcones family private jester. With a chuckle that should have seemed a little bit more suspicious to the jester, the Falcones agreed, and he went with them to the shop, thinking that he'd just turned his biggest failure into his biggest success, finally getting work as a jester. He and the two Falcones he was with went into the shop, and they told him that they were going to the back to smash things and that he should smash everything up front. The jester tore into everything he could. He smashed tables and windows and tore textiles. But within a few minutes, the Moronis arrived, some of them being the very ones that had just been beating him up at the bar earlier. He ran to the back ready to tell the Falcones to flee, but as he got to the back, he found that they were nowhere to be seen. And not only that, the back of this store didn't look like a textiles shop, but that of a bootleg potion brewing area. There were walls full of shelves that, admittedly now all of the potions that had been on them were on the ground smashed, and many of them had been taken and thrown into these other larger vats of potions that now had multicolored mixes of bubbling brews. He looked down at the area below him, searching anywhere for the Falcones, but he couldn't see them. The Moronis were charging in on him. He was terrified. He backed up and then slipped. He fell over the handrail and fell straight into one of the bubbling vats. Now, the Moronis had disposed of the body, and as planned, nobody suspected that the Falcones had been involved, and everything in Goth Hollow went on as it normally would. But within a few weeks, a new jester showed up in town, who didn't necessarily look like the old one. His skin was a pure white, his eyes were dark, except for small glowing green glints in their center. He had some green veins going through his skin, and he dressed better and stood more confidently, always walking around with a large grin. But he did happen to carry 4 throwing knives on him, admittedly far sharper than the previous jesters, but still a similar trait. Very quickly, people were impressed by this jester's jokes. He told them on the streets and in some bars, and very soon, the members of the Ace of Hearts asked him to come play their tavern. The show was packed, and both members of the Falcone family and the Moroni family were in attendance. But like the rest of the audience at that show, none of them would leave there alive. Pamea Isley lived in a small clan of druids called the Vertuli. The clan worshipped the deities Shanto and Sylvanas, the Earth Mother and Forest Father. They practiced magic pertaining specifically to plant life, and despite their slowly shrinking numbers, lived a peaceful life. They had a tenuous agreement with the nearest city, Goth Hollow, to stay out of each other's territory. The Vertuli were untrusting of modern civilization because of stories they'd heard of other druid clans being run off their land by expanding cities. But Pamea was fascinated by the cities. While she was a true nature-loving druid, she believed there was room for the city and forest dwellers to live in harmony. She would make frequent and semi-secret trips into Goth Hollow, and eventually there she found love. A handsome wizard named Jesper Woodrew had caught her eye, and the two drew very close over the next few weeks. He was especially curious about her people and their magic and their way of life. Eventually, they got close enough that Jesper felt comfortable enough to ask that she bring him to the Vertuli village. She was hesitant, but knew that if her people could see a functioning relationship between a city dweller and a Vertuli, then it might open up a new era of peace and trust. She brought Jesper to the village with great skepticism from her people. They didn't force him out or act hostile towards him, but none other than Isley were comfortable with his being there. Still, he stayed, he ate with them, and he was shown around the village, and he took it all in very analytically, listening and absorbing every detail of what he could learn about the Vertuli and their home. At the end of the day, Jesper returned home, and Isley was optimistic. While she could feel the tension, she believed that more days like this could slowly bring down the walls between her people and the people of Gothalo. Then the next day came, and it started out normally. Isley went into Gothalo to see Jesper, but he never showed up to meet her. She waited and waited, but he never arrived, and eventually she just decided to head home, and as she left the city and headed to the entrance of the forest, she could see tracks. Both horses and humans headed straight in the direction of her village. She ran and ran as fast as she could, praying that she was wrong about what might be happening, but she wasn't. The Vertuli village was in flames, fire-casting wizards were torching it, and everyone in sight was long dead and burning. All of her people were gone. The spells the casters were using were perfectly selected to target the weaknesses of the village people. Isley watched in horror, but the sharpest blade in her heart came when she saw Jesper aiding in the destruction of her home. She considered charging in there and then to rip his head from his shoulders, but she knew she was outnumbered in that moment. She retreated for now farther into the woods and became a recluse, living on her own, but she began training more and more, becoming an ultimate master of forest magic. She gained a near impossible control over the plant life of the forest, and swore to use it as vengeance against Gothalo and all of those that had taken her village and her people from her. And when she would eventually find him, she had very specific, vile plans for Jesper Woodrue. In the Orc clan of Priscos, strength was praised above all else. So when a small half-breed orc was born into the village, he was considered an embarrassment. He was the bane of the tribe, and when he reached the meager age of 5, they cast him out into the creature-ridden forest to either die or survive on his own. But while the boy was lacking in inherent strength of body, he had incredible strength of will. He trained and trained to fight off the creatures of the forest, both continuing to build strength and feeding off of some of the most dangerous creatures he could find. For years and years, he fought and survived and grew stronger and stronger. Eventually, well, his height wasn't that of a full-grown orc. His body was strong, far stronger than that of many natural orcs. As a teenager, after living most of his life in isolation, he returned to the Priscos clan and proceeded to challenge their top fighters to matches to the death, hoping to catch the attention of the clan leader. He defeated all of the enemies that agreed to face him, and the people started to rally around him, largely because they were impressed by his strength, even more so because of his half-breed heritage. This was strength you could only come across through grueling training. Now, it was the clan rule that no one could challenge the village leader to combat, but if he challenged them and they were to succeed and defeat him, the leadership of the clan would go to the victor. And not only that, the village leader was granted sole access to a certain potion, the Potion of Priscos, that had been created by the village elders a century ago. It was a potion of giant strength, but a specific one that had been created to allow the user to have incredible power for 12 hours. Of course, it was rarely used because there were dire side effects. After those 12 hours, your body would be incredibly weak. So if you needed to keep up the strength, you would keep having to take the potion every 12 hours. But regardless, Bane had his eye on the potion, and after enough battles proving his worth and killing some of the clan's best fighters, the leader could no longer stand by and watch. He challenged Bane largely to stop him from reducing their numbers, and so the whole clan watched as a half-breed orc they'd once cast aside for death because of perceived weakness pummeled their great leader to death's door. He did indeed win the fight and immediately went to the village elders for his prize. They urged him to only consider using the potion under the most dire of necessities, but he ignored the council. He took the first potion, ensured that there was a sufficient supply and a recipe for recreating it, and then he began his slaughter. He'd never forgiven the village for casting him aside and considered this a lesson to anyone who would think less of him. He massacred his entire clan and became the last remaining Priscos orc, a clan that now only had one half-breed member. He became a wanderer and frequently went looking for fights to prove his strength, and began reading more and more, trying to enhance his mind, believing that his clan had stopped too soon at physical strength and hadn't gone on to create any mental strength. His wandering continued and eventually led him to a city called Gothalo. But after he'd started one too many fights with innocent city folks, a certain vigilante came his way. And this opponent, who seemed less intimidating and smaller than the half-breed orc, easily bested him in combat and imprisoned Bane and gave Bane a new obsession. Bane saw this vigilante as his only equal that he'd ever come across and swore that their final battle would be huge and epic and spoken about for ages. But in the end, Bane would still be victorious. So what's next? I mean, the meat and potatoes of this channel is basically this franchise swapping stuff, so give me your ideas in the comments. Should I do the opposite of what I've just done, Batman, Spider-Man wise? Spider-Man villains in D&D and Batman villains in Star Wars? Or do you have some completely different ideas? No matter what they are, I'd love to hear them. Also, for this month's PopCross Community Redraw, technically I said that the last day to submit was the 22nd, but I won't start until Monday, so if you send something in by Sunday, December 26th, I'll still put it in the running for art that could be shown or redrawn in the video that's coming out a week from today. But besides that, that's all for today's episode. I'm Christian Pearson, this has been PopCross Studios, home of the nerdiest art videos on YouTube. Subscribe and ring that bell if you enjoyed this, and I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye, everybody.